Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Levy lecture. We have a great program for you. We're going to be talking with Cynthia Beebe, retired senior special agent with the ATF, and I think you will really enjoy it. My name's Wendy Cromash. I am here because of the Levy Senior Center Foundation, who is the one overseeing this entire program, and we thank them for their support. I don't really have any other housekeeping announcements, except if you have any questions, please send them to the Q&A. We're going to try something a little bit different today. Cynthia is okay with answering questions at midpoint during the lecture, so there may be some dialogue. Use the Q&A function as opposed to the raise your hand function, and I will try and address those, relay those to Cynthia as they come through. So without further ado, let me tell you, this book, Boots in the Ashes, is a fun, interesting, easy read about Cynthia's amazing career. And it is a page turner. I enjoyed it very much. It was exciting to read about someone who navigated not only major crime investigations involving arson and terrorism and just all kinds of heinous crimes, but also the politics of the federal bureaucracy, which is a whole other discussion. But it's a really fun read and inspiring. If you have any young women in your life that are looking for interesting careers, it's a great firsthand look. So welcome, Cynthia, to our Levy lecture. Tell me, and first I should also say that Cynthia grew up in the suburbs of Chicago and was an excellent student and athlete. She went to Northwestern for her bachelor's and her graduate degree. She has a graduate degree in journalism. Why did you start with the ATF as a Medill graduate?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Wendy.
Sure.
Appreciate it. Well, it really was serendipity. A lot of it was based on, I happened to be in the right place at the right time. Because when I was in high school in the late 1970s, mid 1970s, I remember reading that the FBI had just started to hire women. And that seemed kind of halfway interesting, but very far away and not very realistic or anything. I thought, oh, that might be an interesting career someday. But I was committed to literature and journalism and such, and I knew I was going to major in literature, which I did. And then I went to Medill and got a master's in journalism, and I was working as a business writer. But it wasn't, necessarily a dream job, so to speak. I loved Chicago. I loved being in Chicago, and I was in Chicago. But I had not actively pursued looking into being a federal agent. But then, just out of the blue coincidence, I met a woman who worked for the FBI, and it was just like, wow, that's really cool. In other words, what I had heard about in high school, here it was, and it was real. So I was able to talk with her and find out more about it and find out more about different agencies. I'd never heard of ATF. I'd heard of the Secret Service, and obviously I knew what the IRS was, but and they were under the Department of the Treasury at the time, but I'd never heard of ATF. And I found out about the different hiring practices and so on and so forth. And to make a long story short, when I heard about ATF, and I learned that ATF investigated bombings and arsons, I distinctly remember thinking to myself, wow, that sounds really cool. I'd like to do that. And back then, and still to a certain extent now, the way that you got hired was it was a long process. It still is, but you took an exam, and I'm very good at exams, so I did well, and I was a woman who had done well. And so they interviewed me, and I did well in the interview. And then you also had to pass a physical exam, a fitness test, which I was able to do. And they offered me a job. So really, it was just, I just happened to meet that one woman who was in the FBI, and she was able to tell me basically how to do it. Because I really, it was just kind of this vague idea in the back of my mind. So
that's great.
yeah.
And you started in St. Louis or St. Paul.
Yeah.
St. Paul.
Yes, I had, I interviewed in Chicago. I knew that Chicago needed women agents at the time. Chicago only had 7 women agents out of about 100. And I knew that they were looking to hire more women agents. But lo and behold, when I got the job offer, it was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, or actually the St. Paul field office, it was called. And I understood at that point, I was either going to accept that job or I was never going to be a federal agent. It's not like I got a chance that I could negotiate and say, come on, let me Chicago. No, that didn't work that way. So
let me just pause. There are a couple of comments. Can you increase your volume, please?
Oh.
Is there anything you can do to increase your volume?
I can move the computer closer. I have a little thingy and it's not working. So I'm sorry. Is this better?
Well, let's see what people say.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine,
Okay.
But hang on, let's see. Yes.
And then
yes.
I'm actually going to holler at my son and see if he'll go run to Walgreens for me to get the little.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
All right. I'll talk louder and be closer to the computer. And I'm sorry, I thought I had the right little gizmo and it had the wrong connection point.
Don't worry.
Sorry about that.
It's been that kind of year for all of us, just technologically challenged.
Yeah.
So tell me about the first big case that you were working on. And I know you want to read some sections from the book. So,
well, do you want me to go ahead and tell you about the case, or?
It's up to you completely.
Right. Well, I'll happily follow your questions. I like to follow questions. And the first big case I had was in Minneapolis, St. Paul. What had happened is when I was right before I went to the academy, it was either right before or right after I went to the academy, I was called out to a bomb scene down in southern Minnesota, and a homemade, an improvised explosive device, what everyone now knows of as an IED, but back then we just called them a bomb. A bomb had gone off at the house of a judge in southern Minnesota, a state judge, and he lived in a great big wooden house, and that house had burned to the ground. It was a huge bomb, and the entire house had caught fire. It was a huge fire, and thank goodness they were away on vacation, because it was the judge and his wife and 3 kids, I believe, maybe 4 kids. And I think there's little chance they would have escaped. I mean, maybe if they jumped out the window or something, but it was just a really terrible scene. So I went to the scene, and I just worked as what was called an evidence technician. I was not assigned to the investigation or anything like that. And then I went to the academy. And
where was your training?
Well, so my office was in St. Paul, Minnesota, but the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center was then and still is down in Georgia, south. It's on the Georgia coast. It's about an hour north of Jacksonville, Florida. It's in a huge facility, much bigger than Quantico, or at least I don't know geographically, maybe Quantico, because that's Marine Base has more acreage, but it's a huge facility. It trains literally scores of agencies from around the world. And ATF was one of many agencies down there. And the reason it's down there is most of your listeners will be old enough probably to remember Sam Nunn, who was a very Georgia senator years ago. And when they were talking about financing a new federal law enforcement training center, he said, that's great, as long as it's in my Bailiwick, and that's exactly where it is. But it's a very nice facility. It's not recognizable now compared to what it was when I was there. So that was down in South Georgia, right along the coast there.
And we were chatting earlier, and you mentioned that you had never picked up a gun until you got to the academy.
Well, I didn't own a gun. I had
Right.
actually, I had actually taken a riflery course at Northwestern. And I remember we went down to the basement because I needed a class or something. And we went down to the basement below tech, and there was this gravelly pit. It looked like we were in a horror movie or something. But anyways, we shot a rifle, a little 22 for a few weeks, and that was it. And it was fine. But no, I didn't grow up with guns. I didn't own a gun. I had no particular interest in guns. But I was a good athlete. But that would be a story that I want to read from my book. So I'd rather not say that.
Okay. I'm following your lead.
All right. So to the listeners, I know last week was I watched last week's show with a fabulous storytelling lady, and
Megan.
mine will be quite different. I'm going to read just a few brief stories out of my book, maybe 5 or 6 brief stories. So this one is about just a page or two about something that happened to me when I was at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center as a young agent. And our second class down there was called New Agent Training. And that training was for ATF agents only. Whereas the first class was for all, it could be any and all Treasury agents. So at FLETC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, I found new agent training fascinating. And despite the heavy workload, the weeks flew by. Unexpectedly, my most memorable achievement happened on the firing line. Our duty weapon was a 6-shot Smith & Wesson .38 revolver, which is a fine handgun, but is now considered underpowered for law enforcement. For 2 months, the 24 of us went to the range and shot and shot and shot. We worked on trigger control and discipline, front sight acquisition, and reloading drills. I can still hear the instructor's commands. Ready, aim, fire. Each time I fired, the silver revolver recoiled in my hand and a flash erupted from the barrel. Then came the resounding boom inside the enclosed shooting range, followed by the stench and acrid taste of gunpowder on the back of my throat. After each practice, our hands would be covered with a slight dusting of grayish black gunpowder residue. I loved it. 3 or 4 of the guys were already excellent marksmen. During the 2 months of firearms training, we shot thousands of rounds, but I had been a competitive athlete since I was a little girl and excelled in hand-eye coordination. I also performed well under pressure, whether it was a big test or a big game. This carried over to the shooting range. During training, there was a lot of talk about who would win the final shooting competition and earn the coveted Top Gun award. ATF is all about guns. Shooting is a big deal. Everyone in ATF knows what it means to be Top Gun. The 3 or 4 agents who were the favorites occasionally had shot perfect scores during practice rounds. I had too. When the day of the Top Gun shoot arrived, I thought that the winner would need to shoot a perfect target, which a number of agents could do. When the competition began, I focused only on my shooting. I thought to myself, front sight, trigger control. As the contest continued, I knew I was shooting well, but I also knew I had dropped at least a point or 2. When the targets were scored, no one had shot 100. I had neither, but I had shot a 98. To my surprise, it was the highest score that day. No woman had ever been Top Gun at the ATF Academy. Everyone was surprised that I won. I was just surprised that the other guys hadn't shot as well as I had. I was happy that my hard work and concentration at the shooting range had paid off. I was even happier that the guys were gracious about it. If even one of the guys had been openly pissed off, it could have been an uncomfortable victory. I knew everything was okay when I didn't pay for a single beer that night. A day or 2 later, one of my favorite agents gave me what would become one of my prized possessions, a black and white postcard with a photo of Clint Eastwood as Dirty Harry, his gun drawn in the famous bank robbery scene. Written on the card in blue pen was, "Cindy, I don't like women partners, but you'll do." I kept it taped to the wall by my desk for my entire career.
That is a great story.
Thank you. So yeah, I was first woman to be the top gun at the ATF Academy, which was fun.
Well, that's great. What do you, Diane would like to know, what are you working on now?
Well, a lot of things actually. I've actually just finished writing my second book, but long story short, I'm a co-author with a man named Jeffrey Breslow on his memoir. He was a very successful toy inventor and toy business executive in the Chicago area. He worked for a company called Marvin Glass and Associates, which I'm guessing some of your listeners might recognize. It was the most famous toy design company in the world. But they also, in 1976 or 77, I think it was 1976, had one of the first mass shootings at their workplace in the United States. And Jeffrey survived miraculously. And that's how I got linked with Jeffrey. He'd been working on his memoir. He was looking for a professional writer to help him write it. He has a fantastic story. And so I wrote Jeffrey's memoir with him. I'm the co-author with him.
Did you work on that case of the mass shooting?
No, I was still in high school. But there was obviously, the shooter in that shooting went ahead and killed himself. So there was not a trial, which means there wasn't a huge paperwork trial afterwards. But I was able to resource it, what had happened from newspaper articles. Interestingly enough, another writer many years ago had tried to look into the case, and the case file out of the Chicago police archives was stolen. So, for whatever reason, I don't know. And, the shooter, there was no mystery to this case itself. There's no question that the bad guy who shot himself and shot other people was the killer.
Was he a disgruntled employee?
Well, he was, but he was also paranoid schizophrenic. And as I write about in my book, I worked a case with a paranoid schizophrenic. And it certainly does not mean that every single person who's a paranoid schizophrenic is a shooter, is a mass killer. That's not true. But yes, he was a disgruntled employee. But nowadays, I think most people in most workplaces, they would have recognized his downward slide, months before he would have gone over the edge, because nowadays people are trained to look for those things. Whereas back then people thought, he was just a little odd. He was still a good employee. He still showed up at work. He was married with a 5-year-old daughter. And even though he said things that nowadays would have been very provocative, and nowadays people would have jumped up and down and called HR or called the police or something. Back then, other employees and friends just kind of laughed it off, like, ha, 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 until, it
was too late.
Tragedy occurred.
Did they ever find the bomber who blew up the judge's house?
But the bomber on which case?
Well,
why don't I read another section of my book that involves that? Okay. So what ended up happening with that case was, I got off on a tangent there. Sorry about that.
No.
So I went to that bomb scene, and then I went to the academy. And when I came back to the academy, by the time I got back from the academy, because I was away for 4 or 5 months, it turns out there had been a second bombing. It was almost exactly 1 year after the first bombing, also down in southern Minnesota. Also, another state judge's house had been bombed by a massive homemade bomb. And this case was different. The house did not burn down. On the other hand, the family was home. The judge, and much like another story in my book, and much like Jeffrey Breslow, who I was just talking about was the toy inventor, the judge, it was miraculous that he lived.
Right. The stone fireplace saved him, right?
Yes, exactly. So this was the second bombing. And the bomber, in both bombs, he placed the device outside the house, right by the gas
Maine?
up and on the exterior of the house. And thankfully for this judge, in the second bombing, he was home and he was down in their basement, which was a finished office for him. And he was working, he was lying down on a sofa, and on the far wall was this was an old Minnesota home, and it had a massive old real stone fireplace. And thankfully for this judge, and coincidentally, this very powerful bomb was placed directly opposite this stone fireplace. So the fireplace is what took the brunt of the explosion. Now the house was still bombed, there was shrapnel everywhere, and debris came, stones and ceiling and stuff fell on the judge as far as his lower legs, but it didn't impact his torso or his head. Nothing solid impacted his torso or his head, and he was, very minor injuries to his lower limbs. But if that stone fireplace hadn't been there, he would almost certainly have been killed by shrapnel, or God forbid, if his sofa had been aligned differently to that stone fireplace, these were very heavy old stones. They would have fallen on his head, and at the very least, he would have been seriously injured. So he was very lucky not to be seriously injured. Well, so that was the scenario when I got back from the academy. We'd had 2 bombings at state judges' homes. I was not working the case. I went and proceeded to do, quite a few investigations, but not this bombing case. And this was started in maybe May or June of that year. It was the summer of 1989, I believe. So what happened was, there was a suspect in this case. His name was Lauren Bell Richard, and he was the prime suspect, but he was also clearly, seriously mentally ill. And the agent who was working the case out of ATF up in St. Paul, he was a very good agent. He was an older agent. He'd made a lot of good cases, but he clearly was not comfortable with the idea of talking to this man who was crazy, quote unquote. It's not that he wasn't doing the job, but he just really wasn't that interested in following where this man's nuttiness led, because this man had written hundreds and hundreds of threatening postcards and letters to many people in southern Minnesota, to judges and to employers and to people in the community who made him angry, and to police. And he was known in the community as a crank and a vagabond. He lived out in the woods in a shack, and he collected aluminum cans to earn money, and he walked around in a trench coat. He'd gone to the local community high school, which was very small, but he was, graduated as the valedictorian of the small high school. He was a bright guy, but clearly mentally ill. His hair was long and raggedy. So fast forward to December of that year, and the agent working the case, it was basically going nowhere. And much to my surprise, my supervisor called me in one day and he said, "Hey, Cindy, I'm going to assign you to the bombing of the state judges." And I was still a very young agent, and that was a major case. So that was kind of a big deal for me to be assigned to that case. But our office in Minneapolis, St. Paul, was a very friendly office, and we go to coffee a lot, and we'd go what we called across the street after work, which meant we'd go drink, and which nowadays would never happen to the extent it happened then. It was a different world that we worked in. And, we would talk about that case. The whole office would. It was a very interesting case, and I'd always expressed interest in it. So I was assigned to work the case. So long story short, I thought Lauren Bell Richard, this main suspect, I was a literature major. So I was willing to take these hundreds and hundreds of letters and postcards and put them, read them all and study them all and put them into a chronology. And what I knew right away, and again, I had just come out of the academy, whereas this other agent hadn't been at the academy in 25 years. And I was very familiar with a federal charge of, you cannot mail threatening letters through the US mail. You cannot threaten to hurt people and kill people through the US mail. That is a federal crime, and it's a very serious crime. It is not protected by the First Amendment. And Lauren Bell Richard all these years that he's writing these terrible things to people down in southern Minnesota, it wasn't a state crime, it was a federal crime. So whenever the state would try to haul him in and get him to stop doing it, he'd say, I'm protected by my First Amendment rights. Well, that was a bunch of baloney. I mean, as far as I was concerned. So I knew immediately this case belonged in federal court with a United States attorney, an assistant United States attorney. But I also believed that we could prove that he was the bomber, or at least it was hard because we could build a circumstantial case that he was the bomber. There was no physical evidence tying Bell Richard to the bombs. There was a lot of circumstantial evidence, but we didn't have an eyewitness. So it's a long story and I could go on for a long time, but what I'll do is I'll read a little bit of my book here. Unlike, I was willing to talk to Bell Richard because I liked interviewing people and I was good at it. And so even though he lived alone out in the woods outside of this town of Austin, Minnesota, in January of that year, I drove down there, and it's not like he had a phone and I could call him and make an appointment and say, hey, Lauren, can I meet you on Wednesday at 2, over coffee? I had to go down there and find him. So I grabbed this new agent who was even a younger agent than me, who was from the South. He was from Mississippi. I don't know that he'd ever even seen snow. It was a bitter cold January day, and I dragged him 100 miles south into the Minnesota woods to back me up on this conversation with this guy, Lauren Bell Richard. And in the first few minutes, the other agent, his name was Michael, he had to get out of the car with me because I didn't know what Bell Richard was going to do when I first approached him, if he was going to flip out or something. But Bell Richard had been interviewed by the cops many, many times before for all kinds of relatively minor infractions. So Michael was there while I first talked to Bell Richard. Bell Richard clearly liked talking and wanted to talk to me alone. And I had a radio, and it was fine for me for Michael to go back and sit in what I call our G car, our government car. And Lauren and I, Bell Richard and I, would stay inside of the car and walk around because I was not trying to pin Bell Richard down. I was not trying to get him in a fight. I wanted him to talk because I wanted to hear what he had to say. So this is just a page or two here. So at that point, I decided that Bell Richard was more than sane enough for me to interview him alone, and I nodded at my partner. Michael was from the Deep South. In the book, I'm sorry, I called him Dave, but his real name was Michael. Michael was from the Deep South, and he cheerfully said goodbye to Bell Richard and returned to the warm G car, where he would monitor the radio that I carried attached to my belt. I hadn't planned on conducting the entire interview outside, but Bell Richard was talking freely, and I wasn't going to interrupt him now. I wore a heavy lined trench coat, but no hat. I would endure freezing ears and feet for the sake of my interview. I wasn't afraid to talk to Bell Richard alone, although I stayed alert. We were going to engage in a preliminary battle of wits, not a fight. I wasn't trying to confront him. We were on his territory and in his element, outside in the deserted woods on a cold, sunny afternoon under a brilliant blue sky. He was free. I instinctively knew that he wouldn't attack me then. I would never have interviewed him alone at nighttime when I'm sure he was more unstable. I believed he was a serial bomber. Serial bombers do not shoot, stab, strangle, hit, or kick people. They blow them up. Bell Richard wouldn't stand still, so as we talked, we walked along a path by the stream, his open overcoat flapping in the wind. We were never far from his shack or my partner in the car. I sensed immediately that he was interviewing me as much as I was interviewing him. For years, he had dealt with the local police and sheriff's officers. He had been interviewed by them dozens of times and knew who they were and how the process worked. But I was an unknown federal agent who had come to him from a world he was unfamiliar with. He wanted to know what I knew and what I was planning. Bell Richard was rational when I asked him simple questions about his personal history, or we discussed the weather, history, or politics. He spoke intelligently about current events and books. But when I brought up his threatening letters, his demeanor changed immediately. His face reddened, he raised his voice, and he waved his arms about wildly. He went off on a tirade, talking about his right to speak his mind and how the First Amendment protected his right to say whatever he wanted. I didn't react to his agitation and evenly told him that his letters frightened people. I told him that people wouldn't listen to anything he said if they were afraid of him. Bell Richard agreed and calmed down. I asked Bell Richard to explain the French translation of his last name that he often used in his letters and postcards. Without hesitation, he forcefully told me that Bell is translated in French as Belle, meaning beautiful. He said Richard or Richard is translated as God or ruler. He said that his last name was literally an ancient title and that he was, just as he had written, the lost, free, inestimable, beyond praise, beautiful, powerful ruler. As an aside, let me just say he really believed that. So the more I pressed him on it, the more aggressive he became toward me. He said that God is justified in his behavior and that no one has the right to imprison a beautiful God. He believed that he had the right to do whatever he wanted, and he was easily provoked to act because he felt he was above the laws of mortal men. Suddenly, Bell Richard erupted into a loud tirade against Judge Nierengarten and Judge Mork, screaming irrationally that they shouldn't be judges. He was irate about their injustice and lack of mercy, repeatedly bringing up their unfair treatment of juvenile defendants. As in his letters, he called them fuckers, cocksuckers, and goddamn sons of bitches. He screamed that God would punish them both and shouted, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." Any doubt I might have had that he was the bomber vanished. Oddly enough, Bell Richard didn't frighten me when he appeared to have totally lost control. His murderous fury was volcanic, but it wasn't directed at me. He stalked the earth with his head down and screamed at his feet and at the snow more than at me. He was addressing the whole world. At that moment, he was God and I was his audience. I knew his background so well that I had fully expected him to become agitated during the interview, although not to so great an extent. I also hadn't expected him to be able to compose himself as quickly as he did when I asked him to calm down. Abruptly, his behavior changed. I could see Bell Richard collect his thoughts as he declared that he was a peaceful man who believed in mercy and justice. His style of speaking in person was just like his style of writing. Violent thoughts and aggressive warnings followed immediately by statements of peace and love. In the same manner, Bell Richard would start to yell at me and then back off and tell me how much he liked me and enjoyed talking to me. I could see Bell Richard fighting with himself. He struggled to engage with me in stable thought, while at the same time trying to persuade me that he was God. Out of the blue, Bell Richard theorized that Nierengarten's and Mork's houses hadn't been bombed, but had been blown up accidentally. I wasn't surprised to hear him try to rationalize the bombings. I told him that unfortunately that wasn't true and that the evidence showed that high explosive bombs had been used. I asked him if he knew who blew up their houses. He said, God did it. I asked him if God would need help from anyone on earth. No, he said, God can do anything he wants. When Bell Richard said, I am a beautiful God, I could see in his eyes and hear in his voice that he believed it. What struck me most was that he was also working hard to get me to believe it too. I felt like he was imploring me to understand that he was God and therefore justified in everything he did. As it turned out, Bell Richard wasn't the only suspect I worked with in my career who beseeched me to understand him. He was just the first.
Wow. So was he eventually tried and convicted on through mail, threatening mail?
Yeah, to make a very, very long story short, yes, it's a short answer. I ended up about 6 months later getting transferred back to Chicago when my mother became ill and went into the hospital. Before that, along with the thinking that we needed to charge him with sending threatening mail, missives through the US mail, we worked to build the bombing case. Fortunately, I was able to move the case in the US Attorney's Office. It had initially been assigned to an assistant US attorney who was actually a very good AUSA, and I had worked with her in the past, but she was not enthusiastic about this particular case. And it had been brought to her in piecemeal and by the first agent who had worked the case, and he wasn't very interested in the case. And I was able to get the case moved to this other gal who was just a fantastic AUSA who I'd worked with on many cases. And that's a long and interesting story in itself, but I got it moved to this other AUSA, and in the story, I call her Mary. And we charged Bell Richard both with mailing threatening letters and with the bombs. And I'll go ahead and tell you what happened. and this was a federal trial. It was a lengthy federal trial. And Belricher was found not guilty on the bombings, but he was found guilty on mailing threatening letters. And if you know how difficult it is to prove that in federal court, and Mary had this titanic court battle with this very good federal public defender over, you know, these terrible letters that Belricher had written. And Belricher was convicted on 5 counts of mailing threatening letters. And to make a long story short, he spent a decade in the joint, in the federal penitentiary. That's where he was formally diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenic, and he got help and stuff. But so he was eventually convicted, and everybody in southern Minnesota breathed a big sigh of relief. He was let out. He did have more trouble later on, but nothing nearly, no more violence. But he was arrested a few more times later on.
Wow. That's kind of amazing. Tell us about the case in Highland Park.
Okay. So I'm going to show you some photographs. My guess is that at least some of you will remember this case. There was a case up in Highland Park in 1993, and the main bad guy was a well-known Chicago criminal defense attorney named Richard Kagan. And he wanted to kill his wife because she was fighting him in a divorce, and Richard Kagan wanted to divorce his wife so he could marry his much younger mistress. And so let me show you a couple quick photographs here. So here's a photograph. That's Richard Kagan in his mugshot. And most of my story is about this man. His name is Ron Petkis. And he was a hitman and a paid enforcer for the Hell's Henchmen Motorcycle Club, which, just so you know, is now part of the Hell's Angels Motorcycle Club. So you get a sense of who they are. And I'm going to go ahead and show you now. Ron Petkis and this other biker blew up Margaret Kagan's car. So I'm going to see if maybe you can see these a little bit. These are photos of Margaret's car after it was blown up. And much like Jeffrey Breslow lived in that mass shooting and Judge Mork lived when his house was bombed, Margaret Kagan survived that bombing of her car. And how she did it is absolutely a miracle. Well, she survived it because she was driving at that time a full-size Lincoln Continental, which back in 1987, when it was made, was built of all steel. And the bomb was placed at the rear of the car, and the rear of the car took the brunt of the bomb, but it was a huge bomb. And she was just a miracle that Margaret survived, and thank goodness she did. So just like quite a few other cases I worked, I was not the first agent to be assigned to this case. And I was actually the third agent. It happened in August of 1993, and the case was kind of going nowhere. And in December of 1993, my supervisor asked me to take over the case, which I was happy to do. There was some confusion. Richard Kagan was a very experienced and canny and smart attorney. And he had come up with a halfway reasonable excuse for why killer, which I believe for a second, but some other agents did. The car that Margaret was in when it was blown up, the plates read Kagan. And Richard had defended a lot of really bad guys in his career. And Richard told some of the initial investigating agents that he was actually the intended target. The car was registered in his name. The license plate said Kagan. And these were some old clients of his who were angry at him and were trying to kill him. And so there was some, and then there was an informant who goofed up, and she later became a great informant of mine. So, I mean, this was a very complex, fascinating case. It ended up half the Chicago Field Division worked on this case before all was said and done. But it was always with the intention of getting Richard Kagan. But Ron Petkis really is a kind of a famous bad guy amongst law enforcement. He was such a bad guy, but he was also this very funny guy. It's impossible to believe, but it's true. So when I was first assigned the case, again, I was a third agent. I was still a relatively young agent, but I had made a lot of cases, which didn't always go over real well in my office.
Because you were so productive.
Well, yeah, and even though my intention was never to make the agents look bad who had had the case before me and didn't make the case, that's how it looked. And they were all guys, and some of them were very gracious and mature about them, and some of them wasn't about it. And so, be that as it may, at the very beginning, I was like, okay, there's all this hoopla about maybe the intended target was Richard, and I'm going to go decide for myself one way or the other. So I actually went back to the scene of the crime. I had not responded to the initial bombing in Highwood. It was technically in Highwood at the Highwood train station. I was working on another case, so I'd never been up. I'd driven through Highland Park a million times. I'm from Evanston. I went to Northwestern and Glenbrook South, but I'd never gone to that place as a crime scene. So now I talk about going up to the crime scene and seeing for myself what the heck had happened. As I slowly walked around and examined the gravel lot on this cold and cloudy day, this was in January of 1994, it was easy to see why Petkus's car and the two men in it stood out to commuters at 6 a.m. on a hot August morning. So sorry, let me backtrack a second. I showed you the picture of Ronald Petkus. He was huge. He was like 6'4", 310 pounds. And on the morning of the bombing, he was in the parking lot at 6 a.m. in this old beaten up sedan. And he had a McDonald's cup, and there was a skinny biker with long hair sitting next to him. And they looked like a couple of bikers in this parking lot full of Beamers and stuff in Highwood where people were going downtown to work. So they clearly stood out. That day after the bombing, some agents and cops interviewed people, commuters getting off the train, and asked them, hey, did you see anything strange? A whole bunch of people remembered this car and could describe Petkus and the second bad guy who went by the name of Mellon. But one guy, an accountant, God bless him, was so worried about these two idiots that he actually wrote down the license plate. Thank goodness. So that's what we're talking about. Petkus was seen the morning before the bombing. It was easy to see why Petkus's car and the two men in it stood out to commuters at 6 a.m. on a hot August morning. Alone, the large, beaten up, rusty sedan would have looked out of place in the lot, which catered primarily to affluent business people taking the train to and from Chicago. Add two disheveled men in dirty t-shirts sitting in the front seat, one of whom was enormous, and they would have made quite a spectacle. I could also understand how Petkus and the second man would have been able to attach the bomb underneath Margaret's sedan without being seen. Most of the time I stood there, the lot looked abandoned. It only came to life and filled with people for a few minutes when a train pulled into and out of the station. But then activity quickly died away again. There was plenty of time for someone to set the explosive device in place. When I pictured the actions of Margaret, Petkus, and the second man, I realized that I had no doubt. Margaret was meant to die that day. Petkus and the dark-haired second man would have seen Margaret as she got out of her silver luxury sedan. She was a slight blonde woman who was about 5'6" tall. Richard was a well-built man, about 6 feet tall, with a full head of dark hair and a mustache. The sight lines were clear from the location of Petkus's parking spot to Margaret's parking spot. Even the briefest of glimpses would have confirmed that it was Margaret, not Richard, getting out of the car with the Kagan plates. The two men would also have seen that Margaret was alone without her two daughters. Ron Petkus and the second man had been on a mission to kill Margaret. Someone had told them that she would be in the parking lot that morning. They lay in wait, patiently watching, McDonald's cups in hand, as people drove into the lot, parked, and walked into the station. After they saw her leave her car, they waited until the parking lot and train station were deserted. Then they prepared their lethal ambush by planting the high explosive bomb where it could be attached unseen next to the fuel tank underneath her car. Their part of the mission over, they got back in their rusty old sedan and drove away. So there was no doubt in my mind they meant to kill Margaret. And that went on to be a lengthy investigation of several months, although the trial, it was a state trial for murder. It wasn't a federal trial. Federal agents can work state cases and state and local agents can work federal agents. A lot of people don't understand that. So it was a state case. But it was a huge investigation with lots of interviews of bad guys and Petkus's ex-wife and his kid and his 2 current girlfriends, and so on and so forth. And we got the second bomber named Mellon to flip on Petkus, and then we got Petkus to flip on Richard, and then they testified. And by the way, one of the things I wanted to mention about the book that I hope and I think maybe makes the book a little bit more interesting or more realistic perhaps than some other memoirs from law enforcement officers is the book is primarily about 4 major cases. Well, all 4 of those cases had lengthy trials. And lengthy trials means huge numbers of public records. So I read through more than 7,000 pages of court documents, of archived court documents on these 4 cases. And I quote them extensively in the book. So I quote trial testimony from bad guys and from judges and from witnesses and victims and police officers and attorneys. And I use their actual trial testimony. So when Ron Petkus is describing to the jury how the heck he built this massive bomb, it took me about 5 seconds to realize why the heck would I paraphrase what Ron Petkus is saying when he's telling the jury exactly how he built the bomb. So I quote him in that, and I use a lot of quotes from the actual people participating in the investigations. And I hope and I think that perhaps gives the book a little added life to it. And that was true with the Petkus case and Kagan.
It does. And this case, the 2 daughters ended up testifying.
Yes. And they were terrific witnesses. The younger daughter, and I'm not sure about the older daughter, but the younger daughter testified in the actual criminal trial itself. The older daughter testified in the sentencing hearing. But the younger daughter, who was 12 at the time she testified, I believe she was 11 when the bombing occurred, but she was 12 when she testified. She was a phenomenal witness. You know, she's just this pretty little 7th grade girl, you know, who should be in class. And here she comes and she gets on this stand and she testifies about an incident when her father had come to pick her up to take her to Great America for her birthday or whatever it was. And from where she lived with her mom's house. And this was not too long before the bombing. It was just a few weeks before the bombing. And by this time, Richard and Margaret, you know, were in open battle, so to speak. And they were Richard and Margaret were trying to exchange papers through the car window. And at one point, Richard backed up in his car, put the car in drive, aimed at Margaret and tried to hit her with his car. Well, Margaret called the police, but she didn't press charges. Anyways, so that's the incident the younger daughter testified about in the trial. And she was fantastic. And here's this young girl, this 12-year-old, and the defense attorney who was smart enough. She wasn't malicious towards this girl or anything, but she, you know, she gave her a hard time professionally speaking. And this girl stood up to that defense attorney and she was phenomenal. But we had a lot of great witnesses. And the daughters were terrific. Both daughters were terrific.
So he ended up getting convicted.
Yes, Richard Kagan was convicted. Ron Petkus made a deal and he pled guilty to 10 years for building the bomb and stuff. But along with that, the state's attorneys, who they were very good state's attorneys, but generally speaking, you know, a pretty aggressive investigator. And I think generally speaking, investigators think there's enough evidence long before prosecutors think there's enough evidence. And the prosecutors were very good, but they refused to try Richard unless Petkus flipped. And the only way to get Petkus to flip on Richard was to cut him a deal. And so I was happy to do it. Yes, Petkus was a bad guy. On his deathbed, he told me he had murdered 46 people, and he probably did. He murdered people for a living, but they weren't the kind of people. They weren't 46 Margaret Kagans. They weren't you and me. They weren't the kind of people that would be missed. Most of them, so to speak, they lived on the fringes. They were other bikers. They were drug dealers. They lived down, he had grown up in rural Tennessee where, you know, there are still feuds. But Petkus pled guilty to 10 years. He testified against Richard Kagan. Richard was found guilty by the jury very quickly in a matter of maybe 2-3 hours. And he was sentenced initially to 42 years in jail. That was reduced to 30 years, but Richard died of cancer in jail. Maybe he had done 10 years or so in jail before he died of cancer. maybe 12 years. And Petkus, incidentally, also died in jail of cancer. But Petkus was a great informant for me. And he did a lot of work with me. This guy, this scary looking, massive guy.
I mean, his picture is terrifying.
It is. I'm telling you, if you had met this guy here, this is Petkus here, this scary looking guy. If you met him in a tavern and you didn't know who he was or what he did, and it would never be a bar, it would be a tavern, you know, like down on the south side of the west side or something. And you sat there and you started drinking beers with this guy and you started shooting the breeze at the bar. You would think this guy should be a comedian. I mean, he was hilarious. He's friendly and he told great stories, but he was also a killer. I mean, but anyways, I could read another story about that, but maybe I've read enough stories already.
Let me ask some of the other questions. We have a bunch of them.
Sure.
Okay. Someone wanted to know about what sports you played in high school and college.
Well, that's a great question. So Title IX passed in 1972, and I entered college high school, I'm sorry, in 73, 74. Back then in high school, even in varsity high school sports, I think for the guys too, you could play 4 sports. There was none of this year-round hoopla, forget that, you know, nobody did that. So I actually played varsity for 4 years, varsity tennis, basketball, and softball. I briefly played volleyball, but didn't stick with it. And I was on varsity for 4 years in high school. And again, I was a good athlete. I was a natural athlete. I'd grown up playing sports. My whole neighborhood was full of boys. But it was also just like when I started at ATF, it was a new program. There weren't, you know, it was nothing like now where young people, whether they were boys or girls, would have come up by the time they were in high school. They've spent a decade working hard on one sport. It wasn't like that then, as you know, you guys would all remember. And then when I was in college, I actually got a full ride to Northwestern for softball. It was only the second year that full scholarships were offered for girls/women at Northwestern. And I was able to get a full scholarship to Northwestern for softball for 4 years. And that was a huge help.
Wow.
Yeah.
What was your most memorable case?
Well, certainly probably one of the 2 I just read about, either Bell Richard or the Kagan Petkus case, or there were a couple others. I also worked this case in Niles. In fact, I don't have a good picture of the bad guy, but a lot of you would remember it if I had a picture of the bad guy. But the bad guy's name was William Lennius. And it was also the summer of 1993. William Lennius was as bad a guy as I ever worked. Ron Petkus was a terrible guy, but he was funny and personable. You know, he was a sociopath. William Lennius, you know, I don't get too big into the whole arguments about evil or whatever, and certainly not every criminal is evil, but William Lennius really was evil. And he had built 2 massive pipe bombs. And the fact that a whole, you know, dozens of people didn't die is simply a reflection of good fortune. But he did kill one person and a dog and almost kill another. He was intending to kill his ex-girlfriend. This was in Niles. And
I remember this one. The toolbox placed.
Yes. And he was such a bad guy that even though for those of you who have lived in Illinois for any degree of time, you'll know it is very, very hard under state law to get someone convicted of a crime where they are not eligible for parole, period. And he was convicted of natural life, meaning he will never be eligible for parole, and he shouldn't be. In another state, in Texas or Florida or something, he would have been taken out in the back and hanged within 5 minutes. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but he would have been hanged in another state. Whereas in Illinois, he's not, he's still alive. He's in a prison somewhere down in central Illinois, I believe. But so that case, unlike the Kagan case, unlike the Bell Richard case, we caught him, so to speak, or I caught him with a Niles police detective within about 14 hours, about 15 hours of committing the crime. And this Niles police detective and I were able to get him to confess. But to back up a little bit, the girlfriend who was the intended victim, she didn't want to talk to the cops. So that cops didn't really realize that the bomb was meant for this young woman, Ellen, and it's kind of like the Kagan case. I was Ellen's age. I knew it was the boyfriend trying to kill her. The boyfriend wasn't trying to kill her neighbor. It was just some dude who was very unlucky. I mean, he was like a 39-year-old dad. I mean, the boyfriend didn't even know him. He wasn't trying to kill this man. What had happened is the bad guy, Lennius, had placed this incredibly powerful pipe bomb in a brand new toolbox. He'd hidden it. And he hid it outside right by a playground full of little kids. And if those little kids had thought, oh, gee, that's a nice, bright, shiny red toolbox, let's go open that, there would have been a bunch of dead little kids around. I mean, this guy was just evil. And unfortunately, the people who did pick up this bright, shiny, brand new toolbox was Ellen's neighbor. And that was because the mom, the wife, her husband, Wayne Conrad, was very handy and a construction kind of guy. And she thought, oh, well, I'll have Wayne take a look at it and see what's in there and see whose it is or whatever. Well, Lennius had placed it underneath Ellen's car outside in the parking lot so that Ellen couldn't move her car without moving this toolbox. But Ellen.
Wait, is this the same one that was at the playground?
Yeah. So the way that it was set up, so this was in a townhouse complex. So there were a bunch of townhouses, and then there was an open outdoor cement parking lot. And right next to the parking lot was a playground. So it went townhouses, open parking lot, playground. And Ellen's car was parked pointing at the playground, right next to the grass. Her front of her car was over the grass of the playground. So when Lennius took this big, it was a big freaking toolbox, bigger than I can make my hands that you can see. And he angled it behind her front left tire so that she could not drive her car without moving that red toolbox out of the way. Well, it was a great big bright red toolbox, and it was easy to see from far away. Those kids in the playground could certainly have seen it. I mean, it stood out. Well, Ellen would never admit to being suspicious of Bill. I don't know if she was or wasn't. She probably must have been, at least in the back of her mind. But she simply pushed that toolbox out of the way. She didn't pick it up. She didn't call the cops. She just pushed it out of the way and left it on the grass and drove off. And then, unfortunately, the neighbor, the wife, saw it and took it into her husband, and he was able to open it, and it blew up and it killed him instantly. The wife was terribly injured. We thought she was going to die. Her leg was very seriously wounded. She spent 30 days in the hospital. It was just awful. The dog was killed, and one of their three kids had literally just walked through the living room seconds before the dad got the toolbox open. And if the boy had still been in the living room when the toolbox was open, the boy would also have been killed. And then Lennius also built a second bomb and hidden it inside a stereo cassette box. And all Ellen had done was pick it up and put it in her bedroom and in her bedroom closet and hid it and pretended it didn't exist. And Ellen's mom was a second grade school teacher, and Ellen's mom wanted to take the boom box, it was called then, to her second grade class and play it for her second graders. And Ellen and her mom got in a huge fight over this because Ellen wasn't using it. Her mom said, I want to use it for my kids. Well, if the mom had taken that massively powerful, more powerful one that did detonate, there would have been dead second graders all over the place. I mean, this guy was a bad guy. But at any rate, so I finally got Ellen to tell me who he was and where he lived and blah, blah, blah. And the cops went and picked him up. And so that night, the now detective and I spent hours getting him to finally confess, which he did. And he spent, there was a trial, a lengthy trial, which again, I was able to access lots and lots of documents that I put in the book, direct quotes and stuff. And he's still in the joint, and he will die in the joint. And I'm telling you, if anybody needs to die in the joint, it's this guy. He's a bad, dangerous man.
Was this the case with the your favorite piece of evidence, the two shaving cream cats?
Yes. And this was actually one of the attorney's favorite piece of evidence, but I guess it was mine too. So I worked, this was a state trial out of the Skokie office up here. And I worked with fantastic attorneys, state's attorneys. And when we did a search warrant on Lennius's apartment that night, The Chicago cop, because he lived in Chicago, Chicago coppers went in there and Niles coppers went in there. I stayed at the Niles Police Department. I was still interviewing Ellen. Well, they walked in and they said it looked like a bomb factory. There was black powder and there were pipes and wires and all this other stuff. Well, there also were two tan colored edge shaving cream cans. And on the sticker on one of them was a little sticker that said, buy one, get one free. And on the second bomb that was found in the bedroom, that Cook County Bomb Squad, which is a fantastic bomb squad, by the way. I mean, they're one of the best in the world, Cook County guys. They came and they detonated that remotely using a water cannon. So they safely blew apart that second bomb. It did not detonate. But that second bomb, there are what are called end caps on a pipe bomb. And Lennius used the two beige shaving cream caps as end caps on the pipe bomb. So the state's attorney would always walk around with the two shaving cream can caps in his hands. And he said, I can't wait to go in front of the jury and say, buy one, get one free. And he did. So yeah, but it was an awesome piece of evidence because it was just like uncanny. But there was there was microscopic evidence. There was evidence up one side and down the other. So, but that was a fun piece of evidence.
That's great. Were you surprised with the girlfriend's state of denial?
That's a great question. Yes and no. I think she appeared very calm and very quiet. I think she was actually absolutely terrified. My guess is somehow in the back of her mind, she had it. I'm not saying she necessarily knew that Bill was trying to blow her up with incredibly powerful bombs, but I think she was absolutely terrified. So I put her in my G ride and I drove her to a different part of the parking lot where there were no people. And we looked out on the grass and she freaking calmed down. And I said, just tell me in your own time and blah, blah, blah. So I think she was terrified actually. And she had an abortion with this guy's, and she did not want that to be publicly known. And, certainly back then, even now, I mean, that's a sensitive subject. And I think she didn't want that to be publicly known. But I think more importantly, she was just literally absolutely terrified of this guy. And I guess I can't blame her. I mean, she was maybe a 26-year-old gal. I mean,
but I guess I don't understand keeping a present inside your house that you don't open. There must have been something, like she knew something was up.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree with you because for one thing, the way that she found the stereo bomb was Lennius had placed it outside between the screen door and the front door of their townhouse. Well, a boombox, it was one of these great big, 3.5 foot boxes or, back when they were huge. And even though a boombox compared to now was relatively heavy, there's no way would have been much, much heavier than a box with a real cassette player in it. I mean, this was a heavy pipe made out of metal. So she would have known when she picked it up, and there was no return address on it. There was not a valid return address on it.
So I guess why did she?
I think she didn't want to call the cops with the first box. And obviously that's what she should have done. She should have called the cops right away. And hopefully the cops, and told them everything, because hopefully the cops wouldn't have just opened the box. They would have called the Cook County Bomb Squad before opening the box. I mean, not that opening the cardboard box would detonate the device, but it was hidden inside of a cassette stereo player, and it was designed to detonate when the cassette stereo player was plugged in. So as soon as that electrical circuit was completed by plugging in the cord, the bomb would detonate.
My God.
So she should have called the cops. She clearly didn't want to deal with it. She couldn't bring herself to acknowledge or maybe turn in Lenny. I really don't know. I didn't at that time, and maybe even now. I'm not a therapist, or I needed to get information from her about who the heck this guy was, and what their relationship had been like. And as a layperson, not being a therapist or a psychiatrist or whatever, psychologist, my analysis of the events and trying, I sat with her like 3.5 hours. It took forever. She'd give me a sentence and then we'd talk about the weather or something. I mean, she really did not want to give me information on this guy, but she did. It just took a while. My best guess was that she was very frightened. But yes, of course, she should have called the cops. And you would think people would have called the cops, but she didn't. And when she saw that red toolbox, why didn't she call the cops? She just didn't want to deal with the cops. I mean, some people don't like the cops. Like, I don't know. It's just too bad. And as a result of that, this man died and his wife was terribly injured. The dog was killed.
Yeah, but yeah.
It's strange. I agree. It is strange.
Susan would like to know, were there any cases that you thought your life was threatened?
That's a good question. There were cases where I certainly was glad that I had a gun with me all the time. When we would go to arrest someone or something, and I was talking with Wendy earlier, 99% of the time, unlike street cops, meaning cops in uniform, federal agents can plan ahead. So when we go to arrest someone, we try to have like 6 or 8 or 10 agents for every bad guy. We don't try to make it a debate. We want the bad guys to be so absolutely convinced that they're done, that they don't try to reach for their gun. They don't try to run away. They just say, okay, I give up. And in my case, thankfully, they always did. So we could plan ahead. There were definitely some cases where I didn't adopt my son until I was 44 years old. And there were definitely some cases where I was glad I didn't have a kid yet. But here's the thing, and bad guys know this. If a bad guy ever kills a cop, I don't want to overstate the case, but the cops will never give up. They will find you. And I will say how it used to be. It's less so now, but that old movie, The Fugitive, with Harrison Ford, it was a great old flick. And when at the end of the movie and the guy's yelling at Harrison Ford, hey, and if the Chicago police find you, they will kill you. Well, they would have. They would just kill you. I mean, you didn't get a trial. Now that's the way, certainly, that it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. Is that possible nowadays? Yes. Is it likely? No. Things have changed. It's far more professional. But if a bad guy goes after a police officer, it's over. And it's over for your whole organization. It's not just you. They will move heaven and earth. They will get you. And they know it.
Wow. In your career, you've retired after 27 years, I think.
Yeah.
I'd asked you earlier if you had ever used your gun. Can you talk about your experience? Is very different from what we see on television, and I just tell the audience.
Yes, I certainly use my gun in the sense that I drew it and meant it many times, probably 25 or 50 times in my career. And when I was a lead agent, in fact, I was going to read you a part. I was the lead agent who arrested Petkus, meaning I was the one who put what we call the habeas grabus on him. And that was just coincidence. Even though it was my case, there were like 25 cops and agents out there, any one of whom could have been the first to him, but I was the first one. But when I was a lead agent, it was just I would just grab the bad guy by his shirt collar and I stuck my gun right in his face and I'd say, police, get your hands up. And, I was a lot more forceful than that. And they would put their hands up. So I pulled my gun and meant it. and, you know, we would have our guns out on certain arrest warrants and stuff like that. I never had to fire my gun. And maybe one reason I never had to fire it was I was very confident with my gun. And I think the bad guys can sense that. But I was also never in a shootout. But I always knew, one of the first questions they ask you when you're interviewing before you're even hired is, could you shoot someone? Well, I always thought that was the dumbest question in the world, in the sense that why the heck would you apply to be a federal agent if you couldn't shoot someone? I mean, that's just idiotic. But apparently not long before I was interviewed, they interviewed someone and they said, could you shoot someone? And the guy said, no. I was like, well, anyways, yes, I could shoot someone if my life was in danger or your life was in danger. If I walked into a bank and a robber had his gun to your head and I had my gun and I could shoot the robber, I would shoot the robber. And, you know, if I had a clear shot at him, because he was about to blow your brains out. I mean, so yes, I always knew I could shoot someone. Sorry if I went off too much on that, but
in your whole career, you never had to do that.
Right. And I never had to fire my weapon. And just so you know, statistically speaking, very, very few federal agents ever fire their weapon, and very few street cops fire their weapon. Statistically speaking, most law enforcement officers never fire their weapon at a bad guy. I mean, you fire it at the range and when you're practicing and training and stuff. But there's a big difference between drawing your weapon and using it to get the suspect or the subject to do what you want them to do, which is to put their hands up and surrender so that we can handcuff them and take them to jail, and actually shooting someone. And that is something that we trained in. It was called shoot, no shoot training. And, you know, we're trained from the get, you know, even when you have your gun out, you have your finger along the trigger guard. Your finger's not on the trigger unless you're pulling the trigger. But so there's a big difference between having your gun out ready to use and actually pulling the trigger. There's a huge difference.
I'm impressed with the training that you talk about, and the discipline and professionalism. There's been so much negative press and energy about government officers not work, you know, government agencies, not individual people, but agencies not working well together. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah,
because we were talking specifically before we started, we were talking about the events of January 6th and
well,
yeah, so
okay, so first I'll make kind of a general comment, and then if you want, I'll talk about January 6th. But generally speaking, federal agents receive more training than state and local agents. And that's because per agent or per police officer, there's more money to train federal agents. So we shoot more in training. We have more training time. Our academies are longer. It doesn't mean that state and local police officers aren't well trained and that they can't shoot well. So I'm not trying to say that, but it is a luxury for federal agents. And when state and local police officers would be assigned to ATF on task forces and we would bring them out on our training days, they were thrilled because we would shoot from morning to night, so to speak. And some of them would shoot a total of 60 rounds a year in training. Well, we would shoot 60 rounds in 5 minutes or 4 minutes or something. And well, I mean, if you look at the Chicago Police Department, for example, I think they've got like 16,500 police officers. That's a lot of police officers. That's a lot of ammunition. It's very expensive. So that's kind of an overall thing. So again, it doesn't mean that state and local officers don't receive very good training, and they train a lot.
I didn't imply that in my question. I
didn't want to. I'm not saying you did imply it. I just want to clarify that our jobs are a little bit different. But so what, you want to know what happened on the 6th, kind of in a nutshell? Well, okay.
This is your perspective.
Yeah, my perspective. Okay, so first of all, there is at least one, and there will probably be several large scale analysis is done of what happened. I mean, led by the U.S. Attorney's Office and private investigators, so on and so forth. But from the facts I know, first of all, it was completely unnecessary. I don't think there's anyone in law enforcement who would dispute that. And when I say that, and the reason it's never happened in the past, is that the U.S. Capitol Police were the only police holding the Capitol on that day, which was a terrible error made at the very top. It was because of very bad decision making at the very top. It should have been denoted. First of all, never before in our history has the day of the electoral count been a big deal. I mean, nobody even knows what day that is. Who cares? Obviously, this time around, it was a big deal. Everyone knew it was a big deal. That was not a secret. There is a federal standard for a major event. It's called a National Security Special Event. It's NSSE. The inauguration is always an NSSE. The Super Bowl's an NSSE. I think the Academy Awards are an NSSE. In retrospect, clearly this should have been denoted an NSSE, but there's only two people in the federal government who can denote or designate an event an NSSE, and that's the president and the director of Homeland Security. Well, I don't know President Trump at all. I don't know if he actually said if it was offered to him and he refused. I don't know that part, but the federal government did not designate this as an NSSE, and that should have been done. And what happens in that case, much as it did with the inauguration, instantly the Secret Service runs all the security, meaning not that they do all the work, but they're the boss. So that means that there's a clear chain of command. And they bring in as many agencies ahead of time as they believe they need. And they all practice ahead of time, and they all know where everyone else is going to be ahead of time. And just numerically speaking, if this had been an NSSE, this would never have happened, because there would have been thousands of law enforcement officers there at the Capitol ahead of time. And there would have been an absolute clear chain of command. That did not happen. So that was a terrible error. Having said that, the mayor of Washington, D.C., who is a civilian, I mean, she's not a law enforcement professional. The chief of the Capitol Police went to her and said, "We can handle it." Well, that clearly was not the case. That was a terrible mistake. And when I turned on the television, they had what's called an outer perimeter. And that's when they first broke through the bike rack things. The outer perimeter, for the number of officers they had, was way too large, way too large. They had to have a much smaller outer perimeter. They could never have held that unless they started actively shooting people, and I'm not saying they should have done that. I'm just saying the design was of the security was wrong from the get-go. There weren't nearly enough agents and officers. The physical design with the number of officers they had available was just ridiculous. And they didn't have SWAT teams at the doors. The Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police were not there in numbers, which they should have been ahead of time. If there'd been an additional 1,000 street cops from the police, I think it's very, very unlikely that the rioters would have ever gotten into the building. They might have broken through this outer perimeter, which was way too large. But if there had been SWAT teams standing in front of those doors, they would not have broken through. So anyways, it was errors made at the very top level. It was, and then there were both, very brave individual police officers and others who were not. And as we saw, and same with congressmen and senators and individuals. And I mean, it was completely unnecessary. It was aggravating to watch. It was just what, it was a cluster. It was a real cluster. It was completely unnecessary. And for history's sake, we as a nation are incredibly lucky that only 5 people died. in a blink of an eye, there could have been 100 dead. In the blink of an eye. If the cops had started shooting and some of those armed protesters, rioters had started shooting back, there could have been a bloodbath. And there were not enough armed law enforcement officers on the scene ready to handle it, who were commanded by the right people who knew what to do. It was a cluster.
Wow.
So, anyway,
okay. Has the internet made it easier to solve cases?
That's a great question. Yes and no. I mean, certainly the internet, but also forensic changes. With scientific photography and blood analysis, DNA.
Yeah, DNA.
Like
right.
Sure. There are more avenues to get conclusive evidence. Yes. In other words, in the past, before DNA, you might have had the right blood type for someone, A positive or O positive or whatever, but that you wouldn't be able to say that blood stain specifically came from one individual. And now with DNA, you can say that unequivocally, it's from this or that individual. So it gives you more avenues for certain evidence. You still have to know how to collect evidence. You have to know how to build a case. You have to know how to create a story for the jury to present them with proof beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very high level of proof required. And I believe it should be. I don't have a problem with that. But it's not an easy standard to meet. So, but then of course, go ahead.
During your training, were you taught about the law and the Constitution and what your boundaries are, what you could and could not do?
Yeah, sure. We had quite a bit of legal training, not as it related to our job, but I also had studied a lot of history. I'd thought about being a lawyer. So I knew about the Constitution and stuff like that before I ever became an ATF agent. But yes, we knew, when you can cross someone's curtilage. In other words, that's their yard. When can you kick a door in? When can you stop a car? Yes, we had learned about all of those things in great detail. And the bottom line is, if you have a bad guy who you believe is about to cause great physical harm to another or to yourself, you can take action. But you can't chase after what's called a fleeing felon anymore. I mean, in the old days, you could legally run down the street chasing somebody who's running away and shoot it. You can't do that anymore unless that felon, or you believe that person is, for example, armed and shooting at people along the street as he or she's running away. I mean, you have to believe that fleeing felon is committing or about to commit great physical harm against another.
Your book, which is available in independent bookstores and certainly from the library. Did you have to get by the ATF or any watchdog?
No,
before it went.
And one of the reasons, the biggest reason actually, is what I was talking about before, is the majority of the book. I write about the history of being one of the first female agents and so on and so forth. But most of the action, so to speak, most of the legal action is based on those four main cases that I was talking about. And they had thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of public record. And anything that's public record, anyone could have written this book to a certain extent. They could have gone and pulled the records on the Kagan case and the Bell Richard case and the Lenius case and used the same quotes that I did. Those are free access to the public. So I certainly never came close to releasing any what's called confidential information or anything like that. So the great majority of my story is public information based on court records and trial transcripts and appellate rulings and sentencing hearings and media reports. And so there was anything, secret, quote unquote, that I was trying to do.
And it's a lot more I will say it's a lot more interesting than, you make it a lot more interesting than the way it was just described. That because reading all that, it would seem tedious, but it's not tedious reading. And you also have a lot of your personal stories. I mean, growing up, when you had to take a leave of absence and care for your mom as she was dying. The political. I mentioned this at the beginning. There's so much politics involved with who goes where and what cases you're assigned to, and that there were parts when I was frustrated for you, thinking like, stuck with it, which is to your credit. And you maneuvered, even working with the different attorneys, and that was really, really fascinating. You have a great demeanor to be able to accomplish all of that, in addition to being a great shot. Have you influenced other women to become agents in federal law enforcement, or talk to classes, or?
Oh yeah, especially since I published my book. I did a bit of speaking when I was still an agent. They try to have agents go out and talk to Rotary and Kiwanis and stuff like that. But now with Zoom, I mean, I've talked to classes all over the world now. Teachers have contacted me via Twitter. I know I'm not a social media person. I am now. I didn't know how to tweet or anything, but I had to learn it, and Facebook and Instagram and stuff. So I've now taught classes, forensic college classes in England, college classes in Singapore, high school forensics classes in Massachusetts. I've taught the forensics class at Evanston High School, and I really enjoy doing it. The kids are, interested in the field. They ask good questions, and I really enjoy doing it. And I was also able to help some of the younger women agents who encountered some trouble, and they'd come to me and say, "Hey, Cindy, what the heck should I do?" And I'd been through it all, so I was able to say, "Well, I think you should do X and not Y." And I think I was able to help some. And for that matter, I was able to help some of the younger fellas too, who were
That's so great. Have any of the people that you have had convicted tried to get revenge on you?
No, not that I know of at any rate.
That's good.
No.
How does your son view your career?
Well, when he was little, I was still an agent. I think he probably thought it was pretty cool. On the other hand, he was little, and he wanted me to go buy him some more Legos or something. You know what I mean? So, but he's been very supportive with the book, and I think he's enjoyed that. He's interested in college and studying journalism and political science. But he's been very supportive about my writing career.
That's great. Okay, let me find some relevant questions. Hang on just a minute. This is so fascinating. Do you have plans for your retirement?
Well, yes. I mean, I've written this second book.
What's the title of the book?
As of right now, the title of the second book is Game Changer, A Tale of Toys, Transformation, and Murder. Because Jeffrey he invented Ants in the Pants and the game Masterpiece, and he was the boss for when there was Simon and Uno, and he did Barbie things and stuff. I mean, so it's called Game Changer, but we're working on getting a publisher and so on, and that's looking pretty good. I'll let people know when it comes out and stuff.
Do you envision more writing, and I had asked you also if anybody, if you've done any television appearances. There's definitely a superhero in the
yes,
book.
I hope to keep writing. I also, and this is just an aside, and this is not why I'm speaking with you, but I'm actually running for Evanston City Clerk as a write-in candidate. So if I am lucky enough to win that, my hope and goal is to also continue writing. But that as an aside. So what happened is, because of the book, just last Saturday, I was filmed by the Oxygen Network on their Oxygen Network runs, I don't know, 8 or 10 or 12 different television shows that deal with crime. And one of those television shows is called Mark of a Killer. And so I was a serial killer expert on Mark of a Killer last Saturday we filmed. And the bad guy's name was Larry Eiler, which some of you might recognize. He was in the early 80s. He mostly killed people in Northwest Indiana, but he did kill some people from Chicago, and he dumped their bodies in Lake County. He dumped their bodies in Kankakee. He dumped their bodies in Chicago, but he mostly killed people in Northwest Indiana. Excuse me. So I was a serial killer expert, and they said they'd like to continue to work with me. So I'm hopeful on that. That's
pretty cool. Is the division you were in, ATF is, I have to look it up. I can't remember the, what it stands for.
Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and
Thank you.
Explosives.
Right. Right.
That's a mouthful. That's probably great.
The alcohol part is kind of a leftover from Prohibition, I guess, or there
Yes,
wasn't.
actually, it's the alcohol and the tax part is really how we came into being. They're from Prohibition and non-payment of tax, and Al Capone and the gangsters in 1934, 1933, FDR had enough of, opening up his newspaper and reading about Al Capone guns down 14 people or whatever. And he said, listen, we're going to pass a federal firearms law, which nobody had ever heard of. And everybody was aghast because they didn't believe in that. But FDR had it, and he had enough power at that time to get a gun control federal law passed. And the way that he did that was he made machine guns, fully automatic machine guns, silencers, sawed-off shotguns, sawed-off rifles, what they call destructive devices, or which we call bombs or IEDs. They became illegal through non-payment of taxes. So you could actually legally own, and technically you still can, like a fully automatic machine gun or a bomb or a silencer or a sawed-off shotgun if you got a license from the federal government and paid an annual tax on it. So when they would arrest people for breaking federal firearms laws until 35, 40 years later, it was for non-payment of taxes. So ATF was under the Department of the Treasury, and that's how alcohol crimes were based on non-payment of taxes. Federal alcohol crimes, federal tobacco crimes are based on non-payment of taxes. So that's actually how it developed. The only way FDR could get a federal law passed was through non-payment of federal taxes. So he was a clever man.
And you're not, the ATF is not in, is it still in the Department of Treasury, or is?
No. What happened is 9/11 changed everything. So after 9/11, they created the Department of Homeland Security. ATF moved into the Department of Justice, and a number of different law enforcement agencies moved around, but we're no longer under Treasury. ATF's now under Justice. Am I breaking up a little, or did you break up a little?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
But continue. Yeah.
Yeah. So ATF is now
so
under Justice.
So it's the ATF is. Okay. Here's a question. I'm from St. Paul in 1960. Oh, this is an old case. Do you ever run into old cases? I don't want to. In 1960, Herman Pastor was shot in the park. It was never solved. that's probably not something.
Yeah, I'm not
Work.
familiar with that particular case, but a murder case, you can always investigate. There's no statute of limitations on murder cases.
Yeah, that's cool. You talked about forensics, and there are shows on television that deal a lot with forensics. Accurate for the most part. Yeah.
Yes,
Good.
quite an extent they are accurate. Forensic science is really its own field now. It's a major field. Young people go to college for it.
That's great. Okay. Folks, we've been to an hour and a half. I don't want to wear out. I also don't want to test our luck with the unstable internet connection.
Yes.
But this was so fascinating. You have great, great stories, and you're a good storyteller.
Thank you very much.
Megan tells stories her way. Just really wonderful. Everyone, thank you so much for attending. A really fun way to spend time. Thank you, Levy Senior Center Foundation. Next week, our speaker is another Evanstonian. Mark Larson is going to be talking about Chicago theater and the book that he wrote about Chicago theater. So no bad guys in that one. Equally fascinating.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. It was really a pleasure and a delight to talk with you. The book is Boots in the Ashes, independent bookstores, and your public library. Thank you so much. It was wonderful. Have a great day, everyone. Stay safe, and we will see you next week.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Wendy.